Welcome to Family History Mysteries, a podcast that tells the stories uncovered through family history research, the unexpected stories of everyday people. I am an avid family historian who has been compiling my family tree for over 15 years, with nearly 20,000 people recorded in my trees. And please put a review on my podcast. That will certainly help in getting the word out there and creating more listenership. Episode 214. Ernest Benporath. Ernest Hilton Stanislaus Benporath started a range of misdemeanors in Western Australia from the age of 21. He was the son of Frank Hilton Benporath and Stella Rose Gorman. Frank and Stella had married in Perth in 1905. They had Ernest on the 7th of May 1906 in Perth. Then they had Hilton in 1908, who was stillborn in Boulder, Western Australia, Ina, then Stanley on the 1st of January 1910 in Boulder, Western Australia, Jean Ivy, and then Eileen Margaret, who was born on the 22nd of February 1914 at Victoria Park, Western Australia. Their father, Frank Hilton Benporath, enlisted in World War I on the 17th of August 1914 as a gunner. He was an electrician at the time of his enlistment, 29 years old and living at Victoria Park. He disembarked at Alexandria in Egypt on the 19th of July 1915. 10 days later, he was reported slightly wounded. On the 14th of August 1915, he was transferred to Gallipoli and promoted from corporal to lieutenant sergeant. On the 27th of August 1915, he was wounded at Gallipoli and then transported to the Madras clearing station. He suffered a slight shrapnel wound to the head for the second time on the 4th of September 1915 in Egypt. His wife, Ernest's mother, Stella, wrote to the Secretary of the Defence Department, "Dear Sir, received telegram from August 15th informing me that my husband, Bomber F.H. Benporath, had been wounded on the 29th of July. However, I received a letter from him dated the 31st of July, but have since been unable to obtain any information whatsoever. I shall be very grateful if you will find out particulars as to when he was wounded, the nature of his wounds, and where he is at the present time. I've been advised to apply to you and trust you will let me hear from you as soon as you possibly can. I oblige greatly, Stella Benporath." Frank rejoined his unit on the 18th of October 1915, and Stella received a telegram saying, "Now reported Corporal F.H. Benporath, severely wounded, disembarked Malta from hospital ship Davana on the 4th of September. Will cable free receipt your request." And that was sent from base records on the 22nd of October 1915. Frank rose to the rank of sergeant on the 24th of December 1915. From Malta, he proceeded back to Alexandria, and on the 24th of March 1916, he rose to the rank of sergeant major and was then moved to Marseille in France on the 9th of June 1916. On the 28th of April 1916, from the base records to Stella, I have much pleasure in forwarding herewith a copy of an extract from the London Gazette on the 28th of January 1916 relating to the conspicuous services rendered by your husband, Private F.H. Benporath, 16th Battalion, and it was mentioned in dispatches. I have the honour to submit herewith Lance Corporal F.H. Benporath, whose services I wish to bring to your Lordship's notice in connection with operations described in my dispatch of 11th of December 1915. On the 11th of August 1916 he was wounded, and Frank Benporath died of abdominal wounds on the 16th of August 1916. Army records, it mentions on the 23rd of September 1921 that Stella Benporath is now residing at New Norcia, Western Australia. And on the 3rd of April 1939 in the Perth West Australian, it announces the death of Stella. On the 2nd of April 1939, Stella Rose, dearly loved wife of the late warrant officer Frank Hilton Benporath, and beloved mother of Ernest, from Norseman, Ina, Sister Frances Borgia at St Joseph's Convent at New Norcia, Stanley, Jean, Mrs M. Casellas, and Eileen. Hilton had started featuring in the newspapers for misdemeanors in 1927. The first I found was on the 8th of December 1927 in the Perth Daily News. Uttering alleged. Detective Sergeant Muller and Constable Wilson arrested Ernest Benporath, 21, clerk, and charged him with having fraudulently uttered a document purporting to be a cheque drawn on the National Bank at Merredin for £10, 8 shillings and 4 pence
Benporath will appear in the City Court tomorrow to answer the charge. And on the 23rd of December 1927 in the Perth West Australian, alleged cheque frauds. 7 charges of uttering were preferred against Ernest Hilton Benporath in the City Court yesterday. Evidence was given that Benporath visited various Perth firms and gave them false cheques in return, receiving goods or money valued at £60, 14 shillings and 5 pence. In all cases, the cheques were returned marked either no account or signatures different. Bail was allowed at 2 sureties of £25 each, and the accused's own bonds of £50 each on each charge. On the 7th of March 1928 in the Perth West Australian, dogged by his past, schoolboy prisoner. When a powerfully built young man named Ernest Hilton Benporath pleaded guilty in the criminal court yesterday to uttering 7 valueless cheques for a total amount of £70, Mr. Levan, in appealing to Mr. Justice Draper for mercy on behalf of the accused, said the case was the saddest he'd experienced in 30 years at court. The accused has just turned 21, Mr. Levan went on. His father, after winning the military medal and distinction, was killed on the field of battle when this son was only 10 years of age and the brother of 4 other young children. His family, well known to me, has struggled and battled on bravely ever since. A better one in Western Australia it would be hard to find. At 15 years of age, the accused got into trouble, and instead of being sent to a home, he was herded with criminals of all kinds in Fremantle Jail. After his release, Mr. Levan said the lad went to college and showed his worth by passing 9 subjects at the junior university examination and later the leaving certificate examination. He commenced a course of engineering at the university, but someone unfortunately heard of his past and the lad had given up on the idea of becoming an engineer. He next secured a position as a manager of a cooperative company at Belka, but a scoundrel who had been in prison at the same time as the accused put him away, and the result was that he had to abandon the position. He came back to Perth with the inevitable result that in despair he turned to drink and started passing valueless cheques. Previous to that, he had shown that he would have lived down his past had it not been for busybodies. If His Honour exercised leniency, the mother was prepared to give her son the chance to start afresh in some new land. After the Crown Prosecutor had stated that the accused had been in custody since the 8th of December, His Honour reserved sentence until a later date. So 2 weeks later, on the 19th of March 1928 in the Perth Daily News, Judge's stern warning. Although he claimed he'd been hounded down as a result of having served a sentence in jail, Mr. Justice Draper told a young ex-university student named Ernest Hilton Benporath that it was more of a case of chances thrown away when sentencing him to 18 months imprisonment with hard labour in the criminal court. Last week, Benporath pleaded guilty to 7 charges of having passed valueless cheques in Perth between the 25th of November and the 7th of December. Mr. Levan made an eloquent appeal for mercy. His Honour said, "I have considered everything that can be said in your favour, and it would appear that from the age of 15 you've been a constant source of trouble to your mother and have repeatedly been in trouble, notwithstanding that you have obtained advantages which few people of your inclination have had a chance of obtaining, and you've thrown them away. It would be useless to treat these offences as having been lightly committed, and you will be treated as a habitual criminal the next time you appear in this court." And appear in court he did. In the next year, on the 28th of June 1929 in the Perth West Australian, false cheques. By means of 2 false cheques, Ernest Hilton Benporath, 23, a clerk, obtained goods valued at 18 shillings and 6 pence and £10, 17 shillings and 6 pence in cash. As a result, 2 charges of having obtained the property by false pretences were brought against Benporath yesterday. Detective Sergeant Muller related that the accused called on business managers and secured their consent to cashing of the cheques by means of a letter which pretended to guarantee his honesty. He was sentenced to 6 months imprisonment, cumulative on sentences that he's already serving. And 7 months later, on the 15th of January 1930, in the Kalgoorlie Miner in Western Australia, Clark gets 6 months. Whilst Ernest Hilton Benporath, 24, Clark, was attempting to cash a cheque for £14, 7 shillings drawn on the Bank of New South Wales at Mora, signed by C.B. Clune at Baird's Limited on Monday last, Detective Smith passed and recognised Benporath and inquired into the matter. When the facts had been explained to him, he took Benporath to the Criminal Investigation Department, questioned him and arrested him. This was stated in evidence today when Benporath admitted a charge of having attempted to pass a valueless cheque. The accused, who has a record for similar offences, was sentenced to 6 months imprisonment with hard labour. And another small article says that Ernest Hilton Benporath is already serving a long jail term, consequent upon his conviction for false pretences, and today on similar grounds, Mr Mosley, PM, added to Benporath's stay in Fremantle Jail for a further 12 months hard labour. Benporath was convicted today of obtaining from Ahern's Limited, by the means of false pretences, £12, 4 shillings and 6 pence, and from Foy and Gibson Limited by similar means £10. By 1932 he was released as he married Ada Wood, and they had a girl and a boy. He is mentioned on the 23rd of November 1934 as living at Norseman, and on the 27th of August 1935 in the Kalgoorlie Western Argus, Kalgoorlie Police Court. In the court this morning, Ernest Benporath, 29, a minor, pleaded guilty to a charge of having been disorderly by creating a disturbance in Hannon Street on Saturday night. Benporath was acting in a disorderly manner near the Exchange Hotel. He was waving his hands about and shouting. A fine of £2 or default of 6 days imprisonment was imposed. Then there's nothing from him for 5 years. However, on the 30th of November 1940, in the Kalgoorlie Miner, at Norseman, when some kegs of beer were being removed from the cold storage of the Norseman Hotel on Monday, 3 men who watched the process plotted to steal a keg and make a getaway. A small runabout bearing no number plates was placed in a convenient place at the opportune time that an 18-gallon keg of beer, valued at £8, the property of William Church, was stolen, and the thieves drove off. Their delight was short-lived. The engine stalled on them, and they were obliged to abandon their prize and make off. The police were immediately notified of the theft, and Constables Galla and Helsby arrested Ernest Hilton Benporath, 34, a minor, and charged him with stealing. Later, William Welton, 42, minor, was arrested and charged with theft, and at 9:30 p.m, John Walter Marshall, 28, single minor, who came to inquire about his friends, was arrested and charged with stealing. The accused, who pleaded guilty, appeared in the Norseman Police Court and were each fined £15 with 4 shillings 6 pence costs, in default 45 days imprisonment. An order was made by the bench for restitution of the stolen property. 6 months later, on the 28th of May 1941, Ernest enlisted in World War II at the age of 35. He stated he was a trucker and married with 2 children. He listed his wife, Ada May Wood, as his next of kin living at Boulder, and this was later changed to Hollywood, Western Australia. He did not serve overseas and rose to the rank of corporal, and he was discharged in October 1944. On the 20th of June 1950 in the Perth West Australian, in the licensing notices, an application for transfer, Carl Gustav Hullman, being the licensee of the Woburn Hotel at Woburn, hereby make an application for transfer to Ernest Hilton Benporath of Kew. He then left Kew and rode to the Army from Bullfinch, where he stated that he lost his discharge certificate. 4 years later, on the 5th of August 1954, in the Perth Collie Mail, barman drove when drunk. Police action follows accident. A barman who admitted having driven a motor vehicle when drunk was fined £20 in the Collie Police Court today, and his licence suspended for 3 months. He is Ernest Hilton Benporath, 48, married, of Hosking Street, Collie. Benporath was also fined £2 for having driven in a manner dangerous to the public, and he was given 14 days to pay the fines. The charge arose from an accident that occurred at 9 o'clock last night at the corner of Venn and Harvey Streets. Constable Cahill told the court that he went to the scene and found a utility truck had hit a car that was parked on the side of the street. Benporath admitted he was the driver of the utility. The accused appeared to be under the influence of liquor, and he admitted to having 10 beers that night. Benporath was taken to the police station, where he said that he had no objection to being submitted to a sobriety test. The test took place in the presence of the local traffic inspector, and Benporath failed to pass the test. At his request, a doctor was then called and examined him. Apparently his vehicle had veered to the side of the road and hit a stationary car on the other side of the road. The parked vehicle was extensively damaged. Benporath told the court that another vehicle approached as he was driving along Venn Street. A number of vehicles were parked by the roadside, and he was not sure that he had sufficient room to allow the approaching car to pass, and for that reason he pulled over to the right. In the 1963 and 1977 census, Ada and Ernest are living at Boulder and he's working as a miner. Ernest died in 1978 in Perth at the age of 72. And Ernest's siblings. His older brother, Stanley Frank Benporath, an article on the 29th of August 1926 in the Perth Sunday Times says that the RSL subcommittee of the repatriation department met during the week and there were a number of applications for the position of apprentice in the Commonwealth line of steamers, and Stanley Frank Benporath was selected, the son of a deceased soldier who served as a warrant officer in the 44th Battalion. And 3 years later, Stanley married on the 14th of September at St Joseph's Church in Bassendean by Reverend Collins, cousin of the bridegroom, Stanley Frank, son of Mrs S. Benporath of Mount Lawley, and the late warrant officer Frank Hilton Benporath AIF, to Jessie Ethel Armstrong, only daughter of Mr and Mrs J.H. Armstrong of Bassendean. And there's an article on their wedding in the Perth Sunday Times. The wedding was solemnised yesterday in St Joseph's Church, Bassendean, of Jess, daughter of Mr and Mrs J. Armstrong of Bassendean, and Stanley, youngest son of Mrs S. Benporath of Perth. The bride was met at the church by a guard of honour formed by the members of the YMCA. The bridesmaids included Jean Benporath and Eileen Benporath. The duties of best men, one of them was Mr M. Casellas, who was an old college pal of the bridegroom. And interestingly, there's no mention of Ernest Hilton Benporath being part of the wedding party or the guests. And on the 14th of February 1931, they had their first child. And in the Perth Western Mail, it says that their daughter, Denise Mary Fay Benporath, was born at Nurse Munger's Faversham Hospital in Mount Lawley, and the wife of Stanley Frank Benporath of Broadway, Bassendean. Stanley enlisted in World War II in the RAAF on the 18th of March 1840. He stated he was a compositor living at Bassendean at the time. In his army records, it says his civil occupation was in partnership in a printing business. He was a printer and he kept accounts of the firm and attended other outside business, and he had 10 years with the firm. His professional qualifications were accountancy. He had 2 years in a college in Western Australia, and he had also taken exams in advertising. He also stated that he had 12 months field exposure in the Army in September 1941. Stanley served as a clerk in stores in December 1942, and then he commenced as a meteorology assistant based in Melbourne. He was in Darwin and Daly Waters in Northern Territory in 1942, and then in March 1943 he became a pilot and flying officer in the 11th Battalion. He was also on the meteorology staff and he served in Port Moresby in January 1946. His assessment reads, he was exceptionally keen in his forecasting duties. He displayed organising ability that was above average, and he had a sound knowledge of the organisation and procedures in the meteorological service. Stanley was discharged on the 12th of June 1946. Stanley and Jessie divorced in December 1946. And in the Perth Daily News, it says that in the Supreme Court today, that a divorce was granted to Stanley F. Benporath from Jessie E. Benporath on the grounds of her adultery with Sydney W. Clark. And a week later, in the Perth Mirror, meteorologists saw which way wind blew at home. Meteorologist Stanley Frank Benporath was quick to sum up Victoria Park draper Sydney Clark, who would wreak devastation when he blew in after Stanley had joined the RAAF. His forecast of heavy matrimonial storms was shrouded in gloom and proved to be accurate. The marriage duly failed to weather the storm. Clark intervened as an ominous cluster of rain clouds in a domestic sky of blue. His high-pressure courting of Jessie Ethel Benporath left Stanley in a low-pressure area. He had known, of course, that Jessie had the opportunity of a job at Clark's drapery business, but he thought she'd confine her activities to selling of drapery. The error of that prediction must have convinced Stanley that meteorology was his forte. Some little time after his return from service in 1944, Stanley noticed that Jessie was Antarctic in character. It seemed that in his absence, the South Pole had been transplanted to their room at the Ozone Hotel. Finally, Stanley shifted his toothbrush and razor to the officers' quarters at Guildford, leaving Jessie and Sid to it. He didn't forget to keep a weather eye on them, though, and was lurking in the background when Sid handed Jessie a nice big box of flowers before she took off from the railway station for a business trip to the east. It was the last he saw of Jesse and Sid until April this year, when he returned from service. Jessie Benporath hadn't exercised women's right to change her mind when hubby Stan called on her shortly before his discharge last June. She preferred to remain in her flat rather than return to the meteorologist. Trained to scent the various things in all sorts of breezes, Stanley was smitten in the nostril by a suspicious odour of Draper Sid Clark in Jessie's continued indifference. His mind persisted in this channel in spite of Jessie's assertions that she wasn't associating with Clark. He trickled in to have a yarn with inquiry agent Arthur Nankerville about it, and together they whiled away many long hours outside while gentle spring zephyrs wafted words of love between Jessie and Sydney inside her tiny flat. Towards the end of last October, Stanley and Nankerville descended upon the flat like a whirlwind, noted carefully that there was a certain amount of significant movement within before Jessie opened the door. "We were just having a drink and a talk," claimed Jessie, when the figure of Clark sitting on the bed loomed into view. True, both Jessie and Clark were fully clad, but there wasn't a glass or bottle in sight. The inference was there as far as Stanley was concerned. The marriage was in total eclipse. He winged his way down to lawyer John Dunphy, who coaxed the story out of him in court and satisfied Chief Justice Sir John Dwyer that in the circumstances he had to assume misconduct. And in another article in the Perth Mirror, "Suits me," said suited Draper. Having seen Jessie Ethel Benporath and Draper Stanley Clark together on no less than 35 occasions at night, in circumstances where anything might have happened, inquiry agent Arthur Nankerville decided to swoop in for the kill on Jessie's East Perth flat. "I never heard anything so ridiculous," said Jessie indignantly when told hubby Stanley intended to divorce her. "Go right ahead, it suits me," says the correspondent Clark. Hubby went right ahead, and although Jessie and Clark filed an answer and entered a defence, they subsequently notified lawyer John Dunphy that they would not proceed. Stanley then married Irene Byers-Reed in July 1947. And on the 3rd of July 1947, in the Midland Junction Swan Express, on Saturday last, wedding bells rang for Reen Reed and Stanley Benporath at St Mark's Church in Guildford. In 1963, Stanley and Reen were living in South Perth, where he was working as a weather officer, and Stanley died on the 15th of December 1984 in South Perth at the age of 74. Another of Hilton's sisters was Jean Ivey, who was born on the 22nd of February 1914. On the 1st of April 1933, in the Perth West Australian, it announces the degrees that were given in the Faculty of Arts, and Jean Ivey Benporath is listed. On the 20th of January 1934, in the Sacred Heart Church at Highgate, Jean Ivey Benporath, B.A., second daughter of Mrs. S.R. Benporath of Mount Lawley and the late Warrant Officer F.H. Benporath, married Manuel Patrick Casellas, the only son of Mrs. C. Casellas of West Perth. They had a daughter Joan on the 15th of December 1934, as well as Kenneth and Cyril, and Jean died on the 25th of April 2002 in Perth at the age of 86. Another sister, Eileen Margaret Benporath, an engagement was announced on the 9th of October 1937 in the Perth Western Australian between Eileen Margaret Benporath, youngest daughter of the late Frank Hilton and Mrs. Stella Benporath of Mount Lawley, to Thomas Arnold Waters, eldest son of Mr. and Mrs. A.V. Waters of Norseman. However, records show she actually married James Crowther in 1942 at Dundas, Western Australia. In 1954, they were living at Carradale, where James was a farmer, and in 1963, they had land at Mount Sterling. So it seems that Ernest Hilton Benporath was the only member of the family who seemed to err on the wrong side of the law. The other siblings and his mother seemed to be very much law-abiding citizens over in Western Australia.
If you are interested in sharing your story on my podcast, Family History Mysteries, please go to my Facebook page and send me a message. If you would like some assistance in filling in the gaps in your family tree to see what mysteries you solve, please get in touch. And don't forget, you can have early access to episodes by subscribing, and you'll also gain access to bonus episodes.